Hi, this is a audio PowerPoint. It's designed for IB higher level students of history, those of you studying the Middle East after 1945. And this is going to take you through the consequences of the 1956 Suez Crisis and through to the causes of the Six-Day War in 1967. It's just designed to give you a general overview and to review some of the key causal factors. So obviously, just to go back to what happened after the Suez Crisis in 1956, you should really have an awareness of the costs and benefits for both sides. In particular, of course, remember though, even though Israel had been on the victorious side, there was a high price to pay for that, and it really, in the end, couldn't sustain the occupation of the Sinai forces. Its forces couldn't sustain the occupation of the Sinai, and by 1957, they'd withdrawn and had been replaced by UN troops. So a high price was paid, but victory was successful there for the Israelis in 1956. But of course, they had managed to kind of humiliate, be involved in a humiliating scenario with the British and the French, and certainly those two kind of former colonial powers in the region were utterly humiliated and also were kind of pretty much abandoned by the US, as President Eisenhower clearly expressed his disgust with their antics. And certainly the consequences now, we're beginning also to see the oil being used as a weapon, and some of the consequences there, which will carry on right through, of course, till 1973, when it's really well used by the Arab states during the 1973 conflict. So failure to meet objectives for Britain and France, and really, although Nasser himself was not successful in terms of a victory against the Israelis, certainly within the Arab world and certainly domestically at Egypt, he's still under pressure within Egypt, particularly to meet his domestic sort of political promises, but do bear in mind he now becomes the kind of leader of the Arab world in that sense, and certainly the kind of key face of kind of anti-imperialism and certainly anti-Israeli passions in the region. The other thing to note, I think, is quite important, is particularly in Jordan as well. This is the end of Jordan as that kind of the final connector between the Middle East, the Arab states of the Middle East, and Britain and France, and the Jordanians are absolutely appalled with it. So Eden, in a way, his worst fears are realised, that we've now got a united Arab world under sort of Nasser's serious influence, and certainly of the superpowers involved in terms of the Cold War, the Soviet Union seems far more influential in this situation than does the USA. So that's the situation kind of in 1956. And it really begins to hit hard across the whole of the Arab world, in particular, again, with a general disgust of British and French imperialist behaviour, and that's certainly not the only causal factor, but it's part of the issue that overthrows the Iraqi government in 1958. King Faisal and his family are murdered, and the Prime Minister is kind of torn to pieces by a mob. So it's really quite dramatic stuff going on in Iraq, and Iraq will become one of the kind of leading figures in this sort of pan-Arabism movement, certainly there. So it's a very kind of bloody ideal that happens in Iraq there, and of course Iraq will continue to provide a kind of revolutionary focus perhaps for other people. Remember, of course, the religious and ethnic diversity in Iraq as well is a key factor for us as students of history, and in terms of kind of coming together of Iraq. And that was how the revolution initially started. It was going to be some kind of tripartite council, and they also allow the formation of a communist party. So big changes in Iraq there, and both, as I mentioned earlier, Jordan and Lebanon as well also will kind of seem to be threatened by uprisings, and in both cases there's intervention to prevent them sort of falling to more extreme types of government. Nasser, in the meantime, over in Egypt, is kind of utterly bolstered, and he will, this will be his kind of glory years in the Arab world, encouraged by his successes. I would say successes encouraged by the outcomes of the Suez Crisis. He there's a short-lived political union between Egypt and Syria, the UAR, the United Arab Republic. It doesn't last long, just 3 years from between 1958 and 1961, then Syria leaves. Egypt continues to use the name United Arab Republic until the death of Nasser in 1971, even though after that time, after 1961, they're the only country in it. Syria really was kind of sort of dominated in a way by Egypt due to the population sizes, and it kind of really sort of collapsed as Syria began to feel like junior partners in the relationship. There had been some ideas that perhaps Iraq would also join, but that actually didn't come to nothing. And certainly there is a strong connection, of course, with the outcomes in Syria, as both of Syria and Iraq will become dominated by the Ba'athist political parties in the years following. But all in all, pretty successful time for Nasser, but really an inability to bring out anything more than the UAR, which doesn't last particularly long anyway. Certainly in the 1960s, remember that Arab Cold War is still kind of echoing away between the kind of old monarchies of Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the newer republics, Egypt, now coming into places like Iraq and Syria. So there's plenty of squabbles. A good example that you could use in your essays would be the civil war in Yemen. This really does bog Nasser down for a number of years, and in Yemen, pro-Egyptian army officers overthrow the monarch and the Yemeni king gets aid from the Saudis. There's a dispute between Algeria and Morocco, also in North Africa, over their border. So there's a number of things going on that suggests that, there's still a struggle to get a kind of coherent Arab sort of international identity, and certainly that's going to cause challenges again when we're looking at the situation of how to deal with Israel. One of the things that I would like to focus on a little bit is the situation for the Palestinians, and Sousa talks about the emergence now really of a separate Palestinian identity at this time, and this idea that really without territory the Palestinians are beginning much more than they had done perhaps in the 1950s to sort of represent themselves as a distinctive Arab people, and that's certainly something that's coming through. After the 1948 war, straight away, Israel is no longer talking about Palestine. They call areas, they begin to refer to much more local geographical names, such as the West Bank. There's no desire, of course, on the Israeli part for any kind of revival in the Palestinian national identity, and they were kind of, I think, just perhaps even hoping, and Sousa puts this idea forward in his work, that there's an idea that the Palestinians will kind of just perhaps be absorbed somehow into the greater Arab people. And of course, again, thinking about the refugee situation and comparing how Palestinian refugees are being treated in the different camps. And remember that Jordanian effort, perhaps more so than other countries, to sort of assimilate Palestinians in their communities. Many Palestinians obviously see an appeal with Nasser and Pan-Arabism, but also after 1956, with the failure of the Suez Crisis and the failure of Egyptian objectives there, Palestinians, perhaps there's a growing realisation that Nasser might not be able to deliver all of the kind of Pan-Arab promise and the kind of Palestinian promise to get back to an independent Palestine. It's all wrapped up always, of course, with that right to return, and it isn't simply the humanitarian refugee problem. There's that added concern then of the refugees. And so two things begin to happen. 1964, the PLO is established. They come through as a pan-Arab effort. Remember, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is formed through the efforts of the Arab League, and the Nasser sees the PLO as a means by which he can kind of control and manage the leadership on the Palestinian question. He doesn't really necessarily want complete Palestinian autonomy here, and that's really one of the things. The Jordanians also very hopeful that the PLO, and they hope that the PLO will kind of become an organisation by which the Palestinian ambitions can also be managed. The PLO, as you know, and you'll go to Scotland, base themselves in Jordan. That's where most Palestinian refugees, and they begin to conscript for a Palestinian Liberation Army. They mobilise Palestinians on the West Bank, and they arm the villages on the front line with the ones that represent with Israel. At the same time, though, there's more independent clandestine developments developing through sort of more local Palestinian autonomous groups, and the most important of these is Fatah here. They're established in late 1958, 1959 by Yasser Arafat. They're mostly students of student organisations. They emerge in Cairo, and they're mostly Palestinian students. So really what you need to understand is there's two things going on, and they're kind of happening in tandem: an official kind of PLO endorsed by the Arab League, and then perhaps more of a grassroots thing growing up in the refugee camps, that is the Fatah. Okay, Fatah are very active. They're involved. Their first operation in Israel is against the national water carrier in 1965. It fails, but it really is a sort of symbol for how Fatah is going to continue to put pressure on and actually be more active and more visible into the actual armed struggle of the Palestinians. Syria will support them. The new government has come to power, and they will also get heavily involved in the Golan Heights. So there's quite a lot going on. Again, you can't simply talk about Arab attitudes to Fatah. You have to look at the different countries and their priorities at the time. Jordan's working pretty hard to sort of shut them down. Lebanon also, whereas Syria is moving into support. As Fatah become more and more confident in the mid-1960s. There's more things going on, and reprisals by the Israelis against Fatah actions continue. They mostly happen against Jordan, and Samu is in 1966 is a good example. A mine is planted by Fatah in Israeli territory, and then the Israeli action is taken against that. And so Israel takes control of the village. They destroy 41 buildings in the village, and they also kind of demonstrate on a pretty hectic scale that Jordan wasn't really going to be able to perhaps to protect and defend the people on the West Bank. So really trying to send a serious message out to Palestinians living there that perhaps Jordan couldn't offer what they were hoping for in that sense. There's a lot of propaganda now against Jordan coming through that their attitude has been wrong. So there's quite some serious consequences of that Samu reprisal, and there's 2 weeks of uprisings on the West Bank against kind of the sort of Jordanian action, or inaction, I suppose I should say. Israel hoped that Jordan would now take a harder hand against Fatah, but King Hussein of Jordan begins now to actually interpret Israeli actions as an attempt to occupy the West Bank. So again, there's a lot going on. In the meantime, relations between Syria and Israel are seriously deteriorating as Syria continues to allow Fatah to operate against Israel, particularly, as we said earlier, from the Golan Heights. Remember, water is always a key issue, and Israel's supplies of water rely on the rivers coming in, and one of the key rivers flows through Syria, and there was a Syrian scheme to divert the Jordan River, and the Israeli national water carrier depended on those water supplies. So that really kind of brings a little bit of the kind of background in terms of the key sort of players in terms of the consequences of 1956 and really the emergence now of a Palestinian national identity. So this is part one, and if you can hang around, there's a part two as well with some more information. Thanks for watching.